The fastest way to discover someone's character is to tell them no. The soft click of the fuel nozzle echoed across the quiet gas station just after sunrise as cool autumn air carried the familiar smell of gasoline and fresh coffee from the convenience store behind me. It was my favorite time of day because the roads were still calm, the sky glowed orange above the tree line, and for a few peaceful minutes I was simply another man filling his pickup truck before work. My blue jeans were dusty from yard work the evening before, my old grey sweatshirt had faded from years of washing, and nothing about the way I looked suggested I spent my weekdays leading an entire police department. I preferred it that way. The badge stayed inside a worn leather wallet resting in the center console of my truck, where it belonged whenever I was off duty. Respect earned because of a title never interested me nearly as much as respect offered to complete strangers. The fuel pump clicked steadily while numbers climbed across the display. Across the parking lot a white luxury sport utility vehicle rolled quickly toward the only open pump beside mine. The driver stopped abruptly, climbed out without even glancing at the other customers, and marched directly toward me with the confidence of someone who expected every conversation to end in her favor. She looked at my truck, then at the pump, then back at me before speaking. "You are finished, right?" she asked. I smiled politely and explained that my tank still needed several more gallons. She folded her arms and sighed dramatically before pointing toward the premium fuel nozzle. "I am in a hurry, and you can help make this easier," she said. "Go ahead and put my gas on your card." It is the neighborly thing to do. For a second I honestly believed she was joking, but her expression never changed. I quietly shook my head and replied that I was happy to move my truck as soon as I finished, but I was not going to pay for someone else's fuel. Her face tightened immediately. She stepped closer, lowered her sunglasses, and introduced herself as Linda Crawford, president of the local homeowners association. She explained that people in the community supported one another and that refusing such a simple request reflected poorly on my character. I answered just as calmly as before. I told her that kindness should always be voluntary and that no one should expect strangers to pay for their purchases. Around us, other customers began pretending not to watch while clearly listening to every word. The cashier glanced through the front window with growing curiosity. The fuel pump finally clicked, signaling that my tank was full, but something told me the conversation was only beginning. Linda crossed her arms again and announced loudly that people like me were exactly why communities struggled. Then she reached into her designer handbag, pulled out her phone, and smiled with complete confidence. "Fine," she said. "If you refuse to cooperate, I will let the police explain how this should have been handled." She tapped the screen without hesitation. I simply replaced the nozzle, closed my fuel door, rested one hand on the side of my truck, and waited in complete silence while the distant sound of approaching sirens slowly drifted across the crisp morning air. The distant sirens never made me nervous because I had spent most of my career listening to that familiar sound from the other side of the radio. This morning, though, I was simply another customer standing beside an old pickup truck with a receipt folded inside my wallet and a full tank of gas. Linda Crawford held her phone proudly in one hand while watching me with the satisfied expression of someone convinced the next few minutes would prove her right. Around us the quiet station slowly transformed into an audience. A young father filling his family sedan paused with the fuel nozzle still in his hand. Two construction workers stopped talking beside their work truck. Even the cashier stepped outside after locking the front door for a moment, curiosity replacing the routine of another ordinary morning. Linda began explaining her version of events loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. According to her, I had refused to help a member of the community, behaved disrespectfully, and created unnecessary conflict over what she described as a simple act of kindness. I waited until she finished before answering in the same calm voice I had used from the beginning. I explained that she had asked a complete stranger to pay for her gasoline, that I had politely declined, and that I had never prevented her from purchasing fuel herself. My words were simple, factual, and free from emotion because I had learned long ago that facts remain steady even when tempers rise. Linda dismissed my explanation with a wave of her hand. She reminded everyone that she served as president of the local homeowners association and insisted that people living near the community should support one another instead of refusing reasonable requests. I quietly replied that generosity has value only when it is freely given. It cannot be demanded simply because someone believes they deserve special treatment. The cashier nodded almost imperceptibly before looking back toward the road where the flashing blue lights had become visible beyond the intersection. I slipped my receipt into the worn leather wallet resting inside my back pocket, careful not to open the section where my badge remained tucked away. I never carried it where people could easily see it while I was off duty because I wanted every interaction to begin with ordinary respect instead of immediate recognition. My job belonged at work. My personal life belonged everywhere else. The first patrol vehicle turned slowly into the station parking lot, followed by a second cruiser only a few moments later. Their emergency lights reflected across the polished fuel pumps before both vehicles came to a smooth stop several yards away. Linda immediately raised one arm and confidently signaled toward me as though she had been waiting for this exact moment. She smiled at several bystanders, clearly expecting the officers to confirm everything she had been saying. I remained beside my truck with both hands visible, my posture relaxed, and my expression unchanged. The cool morning breeze carried the smell of gasoline across the lot while the engines of both patrol cars settled into a quiet idle. Two uniformed officers stepped out and began walking toward us with the measured professionalism I recognized so well. Neither officer had looked closely enough to recognize me from that distance yet, and I had no intention of introducing myself before they had the opportunity to understand the situation exactly as they would with any other citizen. Sometimes the strongest authority is revealed only after patience has already spoken louder than rank. The younger officer reached us first with the calm, practiced expression every good patrol officer develops after handling hundreds of ordinary calls. He greeted both of us politely before asking what had happened. Linda Crawford immediately stepped forward and began speaking before anyone else could answer. She explained that I had refused to help her, claimed I had been intentionally disrespectful, and insisted I had created an unnecessary disturbance at the gas station. She emphasized her position as president of the local homeowners association several times, apparently believing it added weight to her version of the story. The second officer quietly took notes while occasionally looking toward me, the cashier, and the growing number of customers who had remained nearby. When Linda finally finished, the younger officer turned toward me and simply asked for my side of the situation. I appreciated that question because every fair investigation begins by listening instead of assuming. I explained exactly what had happened from the beginning. I told him that I had arrived first, started fueling my truck, and was approached by a stranger who requested that I purchase her gasoline. I explained that I politely declined, offered to move my truck as soon as my tank was full, and never raised my voice or prevented her from buying fuel herself. I handed him the printed receipt showing my completed purchase and pointed toward the pump where my transaction had ended only minutes earlier. The cashier confirmed that sequence without hesitation. He explained that he had watched nearly the entire exchange through the front window before stepping outside and that he had never seen me behave aggressively or disrespectfully. One of the construction workers nearby volunteered that he had also heard the conversation from the neighboring pump. His account matched mine almost word for word. Linda seemed frustrated that independent witnesses were describing a much calmer interaction than the one she had reported over the phone. She insisted that refusing to help a community leader demonstrated unacceptable behavior and continued reminding everyone that she represented the homeowners association. The officers remained professional, never interrupting her but also never allowing the discussion to drift away from verifiable facts. As they continued asking questions, the older officer looked at me a little more carefully. His expression changed slightly, not because I had revealed anything, but because familiarity seemed to be replacing uncertainty. I kept my hands relaxed at my sides and answered every question exactly as any citizen should. My leather wallet remained in my back pocket, untouched, with my badge still hidden inside. There was no reason to mention my position because the officers were following proper procedure exactly as they had been trained. Watching them work quietly reminded me why professionalism matters so much. A badge should never replace evidence, and authority should never replace fairness. The older officer took one more thoughtful look at my face before glancing toward my truck, where a small department parking permit rested discreetly in the lower corner of the windshield. He narrowed his eyes for just a moment as though a memory had finally connected with what he was seeing. Linda noticed none of it. She remained completely convinced that the next few moments would end with the officers proving her right. I simply waited, knowing that patience often reveals the truth long before explanations ever do. The older officer took 2 slow steps toward my truck, studying the small parking permit displayed in the lower corner of the windshield before looking back at me with growing curiosity. I could almost see the moment recognition began replacing uncertainty. He did not say anything immediately because professionalism comes before assumptions, even when you think you know someone. Instead, he quietly asked if he could see my identification. I nodded, reached carefully into my back pocket, and removed the same worn leather wallet that had remained there throughout the entire conversation. I opened it just far enough to remove my driver's license first, handing it to him exactly the way any citizen would during a routine interaction. As I did, the leather folded back slightly, revealing the edge of a polished badge tucked inside a separate compartment. The officer's eyes widened for only a fraction of a second before he looked directly at me again. He glanced from my face to the badge, then back to the driver's license, and finally allowed himself a small, respectful smile. "Good morning, Chief Harper," he said calmly. The words seemed to freeze the entire gas station. The construction workers stopped whispering. The cashier stood completely still in the doorway. Even the father who had been preparing to leave remained beside his sedan with the driver's door still open. Linda Crawford slowly turned toward me, confusion replacing the confidence she had carried since stepping out of her sport utility vehicle. She stared at the badge, then at the officers, as though waiting for someone to explain what had just happened. I simply smiled politely and greeted both officers by name before thanking them for handling the call professionally. I made no mention of my position because they had already conducted themselves exactly as they should have. They listened to both sides, collected witness statements, reviewed available facts, and treated everyone with respect before reaching any conclusions. That was precisely the standard I expected from every member of the department, whether I happened to be standing beside them or not. The younger officer looked genuinely surprised before offering a respectful greeting of his own. He admitted he had never met me outside department headquarters and had only seen official photographs during academy orientation. I told him he had done exactly the right thing by treating me like any other citizen. Linda finally found her voice and asked why I had never mentioned who I was. I answered honestly. My job does not change the rules of everyday life. Buying gasoline, standing in line, or saying no to an unreasonable request should not require a title. Respect that depends entirely upon a badge is not real respect at all. Around us, the tension that had filled the station only minutes earlier quietly faded into thoughtful silence. Nobody seemed interested in arguments anymore. Instead, every person present had just watched a simple misunderstanding become an unexpected lesson about fairness, patience, and professionalism. The older officer handed back my driver's license, and I placed the wallet into my pocket again with the badge hidden exactly where it had been all morning. Nothing about my position had changed since I arrived at the station. The only thing that had changed was that everyone else finally understood why I had remained so calm from the very beginning. Once everyone understood who I was, I made it clear that nothing about the investigation should change because of my position. I thanked both officers for remaining professional from the moment they arrived and reminded them that the facts should always guide every decision. The younger officer nodded immediately while the older officer continued reviewing the statements collected from everyone who had witnessed the conversation. The cashier described exactly how Linda Crawford had approached me and requested that I pay for her gasoline. One construction worker confirmed hearing me politely decline before offering to move my truck as soon as I finished fueling. The father filling his family sedan explained that he never heard me raise my voice or behave disrespectfully. Every independent account matched the others with remarkable consistency. Linda stood quietly beside her vehicle, occasionally looking toward the officers as though hoping someone would discover information that supported her original complaint. Instead, the younger officer asked whether the gas station maintained security cameras covering the fuel pumps. The cashier quickly confirmed that multiple cameras recorded the entire forecourt 24 hours a day and offered to retrieve the footage. A few minutes later he returned with the store manager, who reviewed the recording inside the office before inviting both officers to watch it. I remained outside near my truck because there was no reason for me to participate. Good investigations rely on evidence, not influence. The cool morning breeze carried the familiar smell of fresh coffee each time the convenience store door opened, while customers quietly resumed their routines, though many still glanced toward the office windows with understandable curiosity. After several minutes, the officers stepped back outside. The younger officer explained that the video matched every witness statement. It clearly showed Linda approaching me, requesting that I purchase her gasoline, and my calm refusal without any threatening language or disruptive behavior. The footage also confirmed that I had remained beside my vehicle throughout the encounter and had never interfered with anyone else's ability to use the station. The older officer thanked the store manager for preserving the recording and noted the incident number so the evidence would be properly documented if needed later. Linda finally spoke, her voice noticeably softer than before. She admitted she had expected the officers to persuade me to change my mind rather than conduct a complete investigation. The older officer respectfully explained that law enforcement exists to determine facts, not to pressure citizens into paying for another person's purchases. Every call deserves the same objective process regardless of who makes it. I appreciated hearing those words because they reflected exactly the values I had tried to build throughout the department. Before leaving, I thanked the witnesses for their patience and apologized that their ordinary morning had been interrupted. They smiled, waved, and gradually returned to their own lives as the patrol cars prepared to depart. Watching the officers complete their reports with quiet professionalism reminded me that the strongest public trust is built through small everyday moments, when procedures are followed carefully, evidence is respected, and every person receives the same fair treatment without regard to titles, assumptions, or expectations. The patrol cars remained in the parking lot for several more minutes while the officers completed the final details of their reports. I watched them work with quiet satisfaction because they followed every procedure exactly as they had been trained. No shortcuts, no assumptions, and no special treatment. That mattered more to me than anything else that had happened that morning. Linda Crawford stood beside her sport utility vehicle with a thoughtful expression that looked very different from the confidence she had displayed only half an hour earlier. She walked toward me slowly, stopping several feet away before speaking in a noticeably calmer voice. She admitted that she had assumed the officers would simply accept her version of events without asking additional questions. I thanked her for being honest and explained that every investigation should begin with evidence instead of expectations. Titles, whether they belong to a homeowners association president or a police chief, should never replace facts. The older officer quietly agreed before explaining that the incident report would simply document what had occurred and that no criminal violation had taken place. The matter had been resolved through witness statements, security footage, and professional communication. The cashier smiled with obvious relief because the normal rhythm of the station was finally returning. Customers who had delayed leaving began driving away, the steady sound of fuel pumps replaced the earlier silence, and fresh coffee continued brewing inside the convenience store as though the morning had decided to start over. Before returning to his patrol vehicle, the younger officer asked me a question that caught me slightly by surprise. He wanted to know why I had never identified myself immediately after the officers arrived. I smiled because it was a fair question. I told him that every citizen deserves the same respectful process regardless of occupation. If I had introduced myself before anyone had gathered the facts, the investigation might have appeared different to the people watching. Public confidence depends upon visible fairness, especially during ordinary encounters witnessed by everyday citizens. The older officer nodded thoughtfully and said he intended to remember that lesson throughout his career. His words meant more to me than he probably realized because leadership is often measured by quiet examples instead of speeches. Linda listened carefully before apologizing for allowing frustration to shape her decisions. I accepted her apology without hesitation. Holding resentment would accomplish nothing. I simply encouraged her to remember that asking for kindness is very different from expecting it as an obligation. Genuine communities grow stronger when respect flows in both directions. As we finished talking, the store manager stepped outside carrying 2 fresh cups of coffee. He handed one to me and offered the other to Linda with a friendly smile that immediately eased the remaining tension. We all laughed softly about how an ordinary stop for gasoline had unexpectedly become the busiest morning the station had seen in months. The officers climbed back into their cruisers, their emergency lights now turned off, and drove away at normal speed. I watched them disappear beyond the intersection before looking once more at the familiar fuel pump where everything had begun. The leather wallet containing my badge rested quietly inside my pocket exactly where it had been from the beginning, reminding me once again that true authority is strongest when it never needs to introduce itself first. The following Monday morning began like hundreds of others at department headquarters, with the familiar aroma of fresh coffee drifting through the briefing room and the steady rhythm of officers preparing for another week of service. I had almost forgotten about the gas station until my administrative assistant placed a neatly organized folder on my desk. Inside were the completed incident report, witness statements, and the security camera summary from the station. Every document matched exactly what I had experienced that morning. There were no surprises because professionalism leaves a very consistent paper trail. Before filing the report, I read each page carefully, not because I doubted my officers, but because I believed every completed investigation deserved the same attention regardless of who appeared in it. The younger officer had documented every statement objectively. The older officer had verified the video evidence without adding unnecessary opinions. Their work reflected the department values we discussed during every training session. Later that afternoon, I received a courteous email from the manager of the gas station thanking the responding officers for handling the situation calmly and professionally. He explained that several customers had commented on how respectful everyone remained despite the disagreement. Reading those words reminded me that the public notices far more than many people realize. They remember whether voices stay calm, whether facts matter, and whether fairness is visible. 2 days later another message arrived, this time from the Homeowners Association. Linda Crawford requested an opportunity to meet in person. She explained that after reflecting on the incident she believed it would be appropriate to discuss the matter privately rather than allowing one uncomfortable morning to define future interactions within the community. I accepted the invitation because resolving misunderstandings is always more valuable than preserving pride. The meeting took place inside the association conference room overlooking neatly maintained streets lined with mature oak trees and carefully landscaped sidewalks. Linda greeted me politely, noticeably different from the woman who had approached me at the fuel pump only days earlier. Several members of the Homeowners Association board were also present. They thanked me for taking the time to visit and explained that they had reviewed the incident after speaking with Linda and learning about the complete investigation. Their greatest concern was not embarrassment but making certain similar misunderstandings would not happen again. We spent nearly an hour discussing something much larger than gasoline. We talked about respectful communication, assumptions, community expectations, and the importance of treating every person with the same courtesy regardless of appearance, occupation, or social position. Nobody argued because there was nothing left to defend. Facts had already settled the original disagreement. What remained was an opportunity to improve relationships. Before the meeting ended, Linda sincerely apologized once again for assuming authority entitled her to special treatment. I accepted without hesitation and thanked her for having the courage to acknowledge the mistake publicly before the board. That simple conversation accomplished more than any argument ever could have. As I walked back toward my truck parked outside the community clubhouse, I glanced at the leather wallet resting inside the center console. The badge remained exactly where it always had, hidden from view unless duty required otherwise. It occurred to me that the most meaningful victory from the entire experience was not that people discovered who I was. It was that everyone involved left understanding how they should treat someone even when they have no idea who that person might be. Several weeks passed, and life gradually returned to its familiar rhythm. Patrol briefings began before sunrise, neighborhood meetings filled my afternoons, and quiet evenings at home reminded me why I had chosen a career built on service instead of recognition. Every now and then someone at the grocery store or local diner would smile and mention the morning at the gas station, but the conversation was never about embarrassment. It was almost always about how surprised people had been to watch a disagreement end through patience instead of anger. That reaction encouraged me because communities become stronger when ordinary people see respectful solutions instead of unnecessary conflict. One Saturday morning I attended a neighborhood safety workshop that had been organized jointly by local businesses, community volunteers, and the Homeowners Association. Linda Crawford greeted visitors at the entrance alongside several board members, welcoming residents with a warmth that felt genuine rather than rehearsed. She had suggested adding a short presentation about respectful communication during public disagreements, explaining that assumptions often create problems long before facts have the opportunity to speak. I accepted the invitation to address the audience for only a few minutes. Standing before families, business owners, students, and retirees, I never mentioned the gas station directly. Instead, I talked about something much simpler. I explained that every person we meet is carrying experiences we cannot immediately see. A mechanic may also coach youth baseball. A teacher may volunteer at the food pantry. A retired veteran may quietly mentor young officers. A police chief may simply be buying gasoline before work. Those examples brought gentle smiles throughout the room because everyone understood the point without anyone needing to revisit the original disagreement. After the presentation ended, several residents stayed behind to ask thoughtful questions about conflict resolution, community cooperation, and the importance of listening before reaching conclusions. Linda participated in those conversations with noticeable humility, encouraging neighbors to solve misunderstandings through calm discussion whenever possible. Watching that change unfold reminded me that people are capable of learning when pride no longer stands in the way. Before leaving, the Homeowners Association unveiled a simple community guideline that encouraged respectful interactions with residents, visitors, employees, and local businesses alike. The language emphasized courtesy, patience, and personal responsibility instead of entitlement or assumptions. It was not a dramatic policy, but meaningful improvements rarely begin with dramatic moments. They begin with small decisions repeated consistently over time. As the event concluded, children laughed nearby while families gathered around food trucks parked beside the community center. Warm afternoon sunlight reflected from polished car windows, and a light breeze carried the scent of grilled sandwiches and freshly cut grass across the open parking lot. Linda walked over one final time and thanked me for choosing understanding instead of resentment. I smiled and reminded her that every community deserves opportunities to grow stronger after mistakes. We shook hands, exchanged sincere good wishes, and walked toward our separate vehicles. As I placed my worn leather wallet inside the center console once again, the hidden badge rested quietly where it always belonged. It had never been the reason the situation ended well. Honesty, patience, careful listening, and equal respect had accomplished that long before anyone discovered who I was. Several months later I found myself pulling into the very same gas station just after sunrise, almost at the exact hour when everything had begun. The crisp morning air carried the familiar scent of fresh coffee and gasoline while the first rays of sunlight reflected across the fuel pumps. Nothing about the station had changed. The same convenience store stood quietly beside the parking lot, the same delivery trucks arrived before breakfast, and commuters still stopped on their way to work. Yet something felt completely different. As I stepped out of my pickup truck, the cashier looked through the front window, smiled, and gave a friendly wave before returning to help another customer. I smiled back and began filling my tank without thinking about anything except the busy day waiting ahead at the department. A few minutes later another vehicle entered the station. I noticed it only because it parked at the pump beside mine. When the driver stepped out, I recognized Linda Crawford immediately. She paused for a brief moment after seeing me, then walked over with a relaxed smile that carried none of the tension from our first meeting. She greeted me warmly and thanked me again for the conversation we had shared at the community workshop several weeks earlier. She admitted that the experience had changed the way she approached people, especially strangers. Instead of assuming the worst, she now preferred to begin every conversation with respect and patience. I told her that everyone grows through experience and that communities become stronger when people choose understanding instead of pride. As we spoke, another customer accidentally dropped several grocery bags beside the fuel pumps. Without hesitation, both of us walked over to help gather the scattered items. The elderly gentleman thanked us with a grateful smile before continuing on his way. Linda laughed softly and said that months earlier she probably would have been too distracted by her own schedule to notice someone else needed assistance. I replied that real kindness always begins with paying attention to the people around us. After finishing my purchase, I folded the receipt and slipped it into the same worn leather wallet that had quietly carried my badge through the entire story. The badge remained hidden because it was never the most important thing inside that wallet. What mattered far more were the values it represented whenever I wore the uniform. Before leaving, I looked once more across the peaceful station where customers came and went without conflict, where ordinary conversations replaced unnecessary arguments, and where one unexpected morning had quietly become a lesson remembered by an entire community. I climbed into my truck, started the engine, and watched the early sunlight stretch across the empty road ahead. As I drove away, I realized the greatest outcome had never been that people discovered I was the police chief. The greatest outcome was that they learned every stranger deserves the same respect long before anyone knows their profession, their title, or the badge they may carry out of sight. That simple truth has guided every decision throughout my career, and it remains the strongest foundation any community can ever build because genuine justice is never measured by authority alone. It is measured by fairness, patience, and the quiet choice to treat every person with dignity from the very first hello.